committee will have under consideration Senate Bill 1389. Senator McKenzie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last time I was here, I wasn't sure if I'd get to be back before the committee, so I'm happy to be back, and this time for the last time, I assume. Senate Bill 1389 is a fairly simple bill. It's more of a philosophy as to whether as to how we have concealed carry law in the state of Idaho. And it does basically three different things. First, as a state, we have, since statehood, even before, we've had permitless carry outside city limits. It's always been the policy of the state. What this does, it clarifies, and I'll show you where it does this when we go through the language, that in order to conceal carry outside of city limits without a permit, it has to be a law-abiding citizen. So it's can't be for one of the reasons that you're not allowed to possess firearms under Idaho law. Second, and the major change that this would have is it would allow the same standard within city limits. So we would have permitless carry within city limits for law-abiding Idaho citizens over the age of 21. And then third, it provides a mechanism for those who are 18 to 21 to get a license, and along the same parameters as we have for our enhanced carry license. And so there's a training element to that permit, but it provides that when they turn 21, they can just apply for the enhanced permit and get it if they've already gone through that training. And we've got a really, really good enhanced license. I think 39 states recognize it. And so I'll just go through the language of the bill and then respond to questions as needed. But on page 2, the first change there, starting on line 8, that's where we have the current standard for permitless carry outside city limits. And we went through a couple iterations for this bill because we were trying to address concern by the Sheriff's Association that we weren't inadvertently allowing permitless carry for non-law abiding citizens outside city limits. And so we put in this language. It says that limitation or that allowance that we have outside city limits is for persons over the age of 18 and not otherwise disqualified from being issued a license under Section 11. So basically we're saying those limitations would apply to someone who's carrying permitless outside city limits. And those start on page 4. Those are things like formally charged with a crime, adjudicated of a crime, fugitive from law, unlawful user of marijuana or depressant, stimulant, or narcotic, all these things under controlling law. We did clarify at the bottom of the page, starting on 49, what happens when you get a withheld judgment or suspended sentence, because our current law didn't quite make sense in that if you had probation or withheld judgment after 3 years had elapsed since entry of judgment or successful completion of probation, then you automatically would qualify again. Sometimes you're going to be on probation for longer than 3 years, it really wasn't clear under that standard when you would get your rights back. And so we tried to clarify that, as well as a standard for a violent misdemeanor, which we had referred to under old language, but we didn't define what that was. And so I just went to the federal code and used that language, and that's what's on page 5, starting on line 8. So if it's for a misdemeanor offense, it has as an element the intentional use, attempted use, or threatened use of physical force against the person or property of another. And so I just thought that would provide a little more clarity in the law. And then going back to page 2, where the significant change is with regard to permitless carry. Starting on line 19, that's where we put in to the exceptions of those who would be required to get a permit are those over the age of 21, resident of Idaho, and is not disqualified from being issued a license under those same code sections. So that's where the change comes in to basically provide for permitless carry within city limits for those who qualify under that. Then the other change on page 7, that's where we put in the license for those 18 to 21. And it used to be a discretionary standard. It used to say the sheriff may issue a license to those 18 to 21. We put a shall issue there. I think we would have an equal protection issue if the sheriff was in their discretion allowing it for some, but not for others who would otherwise qualify. And then we set the standards for that license, which is the same as the enhanced carry license. And then the only other thing, which I think is a clarification on page 8, we have the prohibition against carrying in courthouse, juvenile detention facilities, public or private schools. We put in there language to say that if you're carrying permitless pursuant to this, that section also applies to you. And then we put in the exceptions, which probably people assumed were in there, but were not in the explicit language of the code, that says we're not prohibiting peace officers while acting within the scope of their employment, security personnel while engaged in their employment, or persons authorized to carry a weapon by person, board, or other entity having authority over the building or facility. I think maybe we'd assumed that was in there, but we need to apply the code according to its plain language, and so we thought we would add that. So, Mr. Chairman, that's what it does, and going over the language briefly, but I'm happy to stand for questions.
Are there questions? Representative Luker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator McKenzie, on page 2, lines 22 through 33, the language added to that they're not disqualified under Section 11. Was that left out last year? In other words, is there a question now that those disqualifying events would not disqualify under our present law if you're out in the county?
Senator?
Well, I didn't think so, but it was a major concern. And the reason it came up is because under prior law, it said you could conceal carry in the county for any lawful outdoor purpose. I'd always interpreted that to mean any lawful outdoor activity. So I assumed that meant any activity that you could lawfully do outdoors, which would be everything. And so that language was stricken from the code. There was a concern that was expressed as we were working through the language that meant, by taking that out, that somehow that would allow felons or those who are otherwise disqualified from possessing a firearm to now allow them to carry it in the county. And so that's why we put that language in there. But I personally would have assumed that would have already applied, but just dealt with that concern.
Representative Luker?
Mr. Chairman, Senator McKenzie, so at least there's an issue at this point if somebody was apprehended out in the county with a firearm and they had a disqualifying event, that they could at least raise that issue under the current law.
Senator?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Luker, I think some have interpreted that way.
Okay. Just a different.
Representative Luker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator McKenzie. And so, just to get to the essence of this, assuming we're talking the difference between a basic permit that we have now and the permitless carry, I'm seeing 3 differences. Number 1, you don't pay the fee. Number 2, you don't necessarily need the education, which could be just a hunter ed class. And then number 3 is the background check. Is that basically the essence of it?
Senator?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lugar, I think those would be the change.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Wintrow?
Mr. Chair, Senator McKenzie, sorry, I have a little frog in my throat today. Could you repeat, first of all, what Representative Lucas asked you a question about? In this new bill, basically the big difference now is that there's no fee required, no background check, and no, what was that? Would Representative Luker yield to a question?
General yield?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wintrow, that would be the education requirement,
Oh.
which would be like a hunter ed class or other substitute for that.
Go
Mr.
ahead.
Chair, Senator McKenzie, so just to be clear then, this bill then removes those three elements that would have normally been required with a concealed permit.
Senator?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Wintrow, yes, although if you look on page 3, subsection 9, like starting on page 3, line 29, section 9, it says the sheriff may require the applicant to demonstrate familiarity with a firearm, so, and then must accept one of the following. So it's not a mandatory standard even to have like hunter's ed, but I think traditionally they would require it. And so, but under current law, you didn't have to go through that process if you wanted to conceal carry outside city limits. But now you would just be able to also carry within as well.
Representative Wintrow?
Mr. Chair, Senator McKenzie, I just want to be clear on the background check piece. If a person purchases a firearm, I believe they have to have a background check. If they purchase it from like a gun store or public vendor, et cetera, except for if it was in a private sale, like a gun show or between a neighbor or something like that. Is that correct?
Senator McKenzie?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wintrow, I believe so. I'm not an expert on that element. There are probably others who can answer that.
Representative Wintrow?
Mr. Chair and Senator McKenzie, I understand that we've had a permitting system here for concealed carry, again, if you want to hide a gun, for about 100 years. So I'm wondering, I know last year the legislation came forward, and I believe the language was, as you recall, concealed carry is permitted outside of city limits in any lawful activity such as hunting, fishing. I mean, it had some examples, so I think there were some differences in interpretation about what that meant, and so that's why folks came forward. But at that time, I remember people were pretty particular about this is only going to be outside city limits, but now here we see inside city limits. So I'm wondering about the erosion of the permitting process and why we even had it in the first place. Like, what purpose does it serve, and what purpose do you want to remove? What element?
Senator McKenzie?
Thank you, Chairman and Representative. I think it's mostly just kind of a philosophical position as to whether you want to extend permitless carries from the counties into the cities. A lot of people will still get them because they want reciprocity with other states. Those who are 18 to 21, if they want to be able to carry within city limits, will do so. Just whether you think it's appropriate policy for the state or not. As I looked at the law that prohibited within cities, I think, at least what I understood, it was like put in place about 1909, so a little bit over 100 years. But then, our culture as a state and the demographics were quite a bit different. I think at that time, most people lived outside cities. They worked outside cities. They recreated outside cities. And so if they were going to carry a firearm for protection or to shoot or whatever, they would never pass through a city. Since that time, I think the population has moved. And so, like, if I was going to go hunt or go to a range, live in a city, and I'd probably drive through a couple cities to get somewhere. And so it's a little bit different culture because of that. And so I think it's an appropriate standard for us today, but I think it's just we've each got to make that decision for ourselves.